Hello everyone. I want to talk to you about the essay that you wrote, the main essay in the 7th week, because there are a lot of problems that I found that I thought that rather than give you an individual message each, that I would give you a video. The basic idea is what you have to do. This is very simple, but a lot of you did not do this, is what you have to do is to read the question and then look at the question carefully and make sure that you answer the question. That's the only thing that I'm looking for. I'm not interested in you telling me about the book of Acts or even necessarily what Paul did in those chapters 8 through 28. What I'm interested in is the question. Here's the question. Explain the prominence of Paul in Luke's book of Acts in chapters 9 through 28. Considering his focus on Peter in chapters 1 through 7. Why does he recount Paul's conversion 3 times? Chapters 9, 22, 26. What message is Luke sending to his readers in chapters 9 through 28? The main thing there then is to look and see, and I've given you 2 questions below the main question, or that the main task I give you, which is to explain the prominence of Paul in Luke's book of Acts. The focus is not upon Paul, it's not upon Peter, the focus is on Luke. How Luke used the narrative to bring out what he wanted to say about Paul. So some of you interpreted it like this: explain the prominence of Paul in Luke's book in Acts chapters 9 through 28, considering his focus on Peter. Now, I'll give you, there's 2 ways of interpreting that. Considering his focus, in other words, you would consider the focus on Peter and then refer that to Paul, or else considering that Luke wrote about Peter in chapters 1 through 7, why does he then focus on Paul from the rest of the book? So in other words, we want what Luke's perspective is. So then what I'm asking then is Luke is writing, as we know from chapter 1 verses 1 through 4 and Acts 1 verse 1 following, he's writing to Theophilus about what's happened among them, and therefore he's got readers. What does he want the reader to know? That's what I'm asking you. And so what you could put down is basically it's no good just to write and say Paul's first account of conversion is this, Paul's second account of conversion is this, Paul's third account, and go through chapters 9 and then 22 and 26. Rather, what you've got to do is you've got to shape that material in a way of saying, what is Luke's perspective? You can't just write it down and assume that I know what Luke's perspective is. He's written that stuff down about Paul. Why does he do it 3 times? Has he forgotten? Does he want to? And some of you brought this out. Does he want to do repetition so he can show how powerful Paul was in terms of his conversion? There's lots of other possibilities. I'm just going to emphasize just a few of them. Emphasizing Paul 3 times. Why? Was it then possibly that some of his readers didn't think that Paul was a real apostle? You know that from Acts chapter 1 and 2, that the 12 were picked, the 12 apostles, but Paul was not among them. We've already sort of looked at that and seen then that Paul was one untimely born. In other words, he had a calling from God, which Luke recounts, but it was outside of the 12 apostles. So therefore, it could be that Luke's saying, well, Paul was not really an apostle. That's what he's thinking his readers might say, or there are others who might say the same thing. You'll find that out in the next couple of weeks. Or, so therefore he rectifies that by mentioning Paul and his conversion, not once, not twice, but 3 times. In other words, get it? He really is an apostle. That's one idea. Another is to say, Paul over Peter? Why would Paul be mentioned more than Peter? Peter was with Jesus in his ministry. Paul wasn't. Well, one of the main reasons would be, look what Paul did. Paul actually fulfills what Peter started in chapter 2. And you go back to chapter 1, where Jesus said to the disciples, look, you will go through Judea, Samaria, to the ends of the earth. Well, where does Luke's narrative end? In Rome. He's sending a message of saying, and some of you brought this out, the gospel goes to the Gentiles. It started with the Jews in Jerusalem, but it goes to the Gentiles through Paul. Paul did go in synagogues and tried and attempted to convert Jewish people, but primarily his ministry was to the Gentiles, and he was very, very successful. So Luke is saying, look how good, beneficial, successful is Christianity, because it started in Jerusalem with just a few people, the 12, and by the end of his book, of his narration of history, from a biased perspective, admittedly, that's Luke's perspective, it reaches the center of the then known world. What can stop it? You see? And don't forget that Luke is a Gentile. And therefore it would mean then that Luke is really convincing and establishing to Gentile Christians who would heard this book of Acts when it was read in their assembly, that what? The mission is for you and is not just for Jewish people. Likewise, if Jewish Christians heard the message where they were meeting, they would think, oh, I see, it's not just a question of us preaching in Jerusalem and around Judea. The gospel's gone out to the whole world. And of course, if you remember in chapter 15, that was the big problem. The big problem from Acts chapter 10 through 15 is that Peter goes to Caesarea and is told in a vision to basically preach to the Gentiles. That's the non-Jews. And then when Peter goes back to Jerusalem, what is the first thing that the leaders there ask? It's not, did you convert lots of people? According to Luke, it's, you ate with the Gentiles. In other words, their mind was so closed in Jerusalem, they thought the message of Jesus was only for Jewish people. And Luke broadens their perspective to say it's for the Gentiles. One other element you could have brought out is this a conversion story, which it obviously is, but is it a calling? Is he a prophet here? Because the calling is just like the prophets that are in the Old Testament. Calling direct by God. And again, what the calling could do is the calling would establish Paul then in terms of being a legitimate prophet. And if you don't think of the word conversion like we talk about it in a way of converting from one religion or no faith to another. For Paul, it wasn't necessarily a conversion. It was a transformation from being a Jew to being a Messianic Jew who knew Jesus. All right. And then Luke was with Paul. Now that would be a reason also to ratify his case. You know that, where in those passages from chapter 18 following, where Luke says, and when we got to so-and-so, when we got to, Luke is with Paul from that standpoint. So those are, you notice what I've done there. I've not just talked about Paul, because a lot of you just write down what Paul did or what happened to him. But you didn't do, as I've said, as looking at it from the standpoint of Luke. Why did Luke write like that? So what you must do, you must always do this first, is look at the question and analyze it. All right, that's the first thing I want to say. The second thing I want to say is that we're now into the 7th week, and I'm finding that a number of you are still copying from other sources. And you're doing it in a way, and I'll show you exactly what I mean. This is the kind of material that I have to deal with. I'm just going to look at it now. Let's see. Okay, I'm trying to get where I need to be. Got it. So in other words, say one student wrote this. The issue was the question how a person can be, quote, saved, and then in parentheses, basically find salvation in heaven. Is it free, or do you have to follow old Jewish customs down to the T, capital T? The decision was obviously that salvation can be found through faith in God, not by works. One student said that. And then I look later and I find another student. The issue was the request how an individual can be saved. In parentheses, basically find salvation in heaven. Is it, or do you have to follow old Jewish customs down to the T? The decision was plainly that salvation can be found through trust in God, not by works. That's number 2. Number 3, different student. The issue was inquiry how an individual can be spared, not saved, spared. And then in parentheses, basically find salvation in heaven. Now, do you have to follow, or do you have to follow old Jewish customs down to a T? The decision was plainly that salvation can be found through trust in God and not by works. I've done a lot of study on what's called redaction, and that's how people use sources. I'm very aware of how it's done. Notice this, is that it says here, the first student says the issue was the question. The second student says the issue was the request. So question has been changed to request. And then the third student says the issue was the inquiry. Request, question, and inquiry. The issue was the question how a person can be saved. How, next one, number 2, how an individual can be saved. And the third one, how an individual can be spared. So we have a person, and then it's changed to an individual, and you have saved, and then you have spared. I could go on. The parentheses, first student, basically finds salvation in heaven. Second student, basically finds salvation in heaven. Same thing. Third student, discovered salvation in paradise. So instead of heaven, we got paradise. Is it free, or do we need to follow the old Jewish traditions down to a T? All 3 say follow Jewish traditions down to a T. That's what clued me in, because I've not come across that before, down to a T. I guess it's a cliche, which we don't want anyway. Now that clued me in, because I thought, I'm sure I've read that before. And I went through and found out these 3 sources. Now, this is what happened. Either all 3 copied each other, or one copied one. 2 copied one. Or what they did was they got some material, and maybe they copied it or found it, and then they put it in a search engine like Spinbot, where it changes the words that you use. A lot of you are doing this. And what I've just shown you makes me point it out to you in a way that is very, very real. You'll get 0 for a paper. A lot of you, though, are doing it with the work that you do, and what's happening is I can't make sense of it. So if you see on your paper where I'm saying, I don't understand what you are saying, look at the examples that I put in the comments I sent back to you, because there you'll see the kind of material I'm talking about. I'll give you just one example. Here we go. The message about Jesus Christ that a few Jews like subside, Stephen, Barnabas, and later Paul, had lectured, irritated different Jews who dismissed the case that Jesus was the Jewish Messiah. Jewish Christians demanded that salvation was an unconditional presence of God's beauty. I think that was put in a search engine. I can't prove it because I couldn't find the search engine, but that's what my common sense says. And I just want to encourage you. I want to encourage you to respect yourself and to be proud of what you write, and make sure you write in your own words and think. Think about the question and then write, after you've done the study, how to answer it. Make a few notes about how your question will be answered. You've only got 900 words, and most of you are doing right, which is beginning paragraph, the body of the paper, and then a short conclusion. That's exactly what I'm looking for. Write your papers like that, and then what will happen is, as you focus on the question, then you'll get a good grade, because essentially I'm only looking for one thing, that's all, and that is Luke's perspective in this case upon how he used Paul. So respect yourself and write in your own words.